You've said that the soul is, in a certain sense, a spiritual entity, or it's about the spirit, but is it something that is added on to humans? And whether it is or not, what is the soul, or what would you think that it is? You've told us what it isn't, but you haven't told us what it is, okay?
Well, the first answer is, as a scientist, I have no answer to what the soul is. The soul is not a scientific concept. And in the same way that science cannot prove or disprove the existence of God, I don't think science can prove or disprove the existence of the soul. To me, the idea of the soul is bound in with the question of God itself. And if God exists, then we have, in the Abrahamic tradition in the broadest sense, we have a promise of immortality. We have a promise of eternal life. And to me, that promise is transfixed in the idea of the soul. What is my evidence for this? I don't have evidence. But what I would say is that if you accept the accounts of the Gospels, which I think any Christian must, what I base that promise on is very simple. And that's in the words that Jesus spoke during the crucifixion. And if you remember the narrative, there is a thief crucified on either side of him. One of the thieves, I'm convinced, is from New Jersey, because which is where I'm from, and I understand the wise guy question that he asked Jesus, which is, if you're so powerful, get us down from these crosses. And Jesus ignored him. And the other thief knew very well who Jesus was and said, Lord, remember me when you come into your kingdom. And to him, Jesus turned and said, I say to you, this day you will be with me in paradise. To me, that's the promise of what the soul means. I don't see the soul as quasi-genetic. I don't see it as being passed from father to son, from daughter to daughter, from mother to daughter, and so forth. Rather, I see in the soul basically the spiritual reflection of our individuality as human beings. We are creatures made of matter and energy. That much is true. Scripture tells us we were formed out of the dust of the earth. And to me, the concept of the soul is really the promise of eternal life, a promise I cannot test scientifically, but which I accept as a person of faith.
Okay, thanks. I think Alex was pretty clear that he doesn't think there is such a thing as a soul. But what was unclear to me by the end of your presentation was, is there in fact a convincing difference between humans and other animals? I mean, you offered us various theories for what makes us different. Do you think that there is, in the end, any convincing such explanation, or would you say we are simply animals?
Well, we are animals. I would really like to return to the soul issue. Yeah, of course.
By all means.
We are animals, but I mean, as Ken said, we're the only animals with language, we're the only animals that cook, and this might be a difference of degree rather than a difference of kind. We're certainly exceptionally smart compared to other animals, at least in certain endeavors. You know, no other animals going for particle
just
physics or set theory or
quantitative
something.
differences, or do they end up being a qualitative difference?
Well, in the case of language, arguably qualitative difference, at least if you take the Chomsky side of the debate. I'm not quite sure what to make of the qualitative, quantitative issue when it comes to general intelligence. But sorry, just to go back to the soul. So I don't understand why this is not a some very broad sense a scientific question. So why don't we just sort of state the problem without even using the word soul, if that's sort of hanging everyone up. So one perfectly sensible question to ask is, in general, what sorts of events can we undergo and survive? You can ask that about anything, like this pen. What sorts of events can this pen undergo and survive? Ordinarily, we think if I take the cap off and crush the cap into dust, the pen has survived. The pen can survive the loss of its cap. The pen can't survive if I take a hammer and smash it to pieces and then chuck all the pieces in the fire. Now let's ask a similar question about us. What sorts of events can we undergo and survive? Well, you can survive a liver transplant. You can survive a plane crash. Can you survive bodily death and destruction? And on the face of it, it looks like if you think that there's the promise of life everlasting, then the answer has to be yes. We can survive bodily death and destruction. But then one might wonder, well, how could this possibly be? If we are animals, then, I mean, I would have thought it's biologically very plausible, given what we know of animals and how they're built, what they're made of, that we can't survive bodily destruction. So we can't just be animals.
Now, Alex,
what else? And then another answer is Descartes' answer. Yeah, Ken doesn't like that answer. So anyway, yeah.
Okay, well, no, everything you said is true, but it's all predicated on an unspoken assumption, which is that there is only one form of existence, only one form of self, and that is physical. And I completely agree with you that the physical body does not survive death. We are destroyed physically upon death. There's absolutely no question about that. So in searching for something that survives death, you've limited your search to things which are physical, and therefore you're applying this assumption that the soul itself has to be physical. And as I say, even in ancient Christian tradition, the soul is not described as physical, and that goes back to the Hebrew scriptures, and it also applies to the New Testament, because that part is very clear. But you changed the subject when you were asked the question, so I'm going to change the subject when I was asked the question, because I want to go back to language.
Yeah.
Because I noticed you put up the cover of a very famous book by Chomsky on the language instinct. And Chomsky...
it wasn't actually it was the more recent one with Bob.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah,
And Chomsky very famously has argued that we are born with a universal grammar to learn languages. And that was produced by natural selection. So evolution basically evolved us, or produced this revolution to be linguistic creatures. Now, in that respect, he had a long-running argument with the late Stephen Jay Gould at Harvard, who argued that language is a spandrel. Now, some of you may know of Gould and Lewontin's famous essay called The Spandrels of San Marco. I'm not going to go into the details of the essay. After you read What Is It Like to Be a Bat, you should also Google The Spandrels of San Marco by Gould and Lewontin. It's a marvelous essay. It's taught in English and literature classes simply for its rhetorical value. It's just a beautiful piece of writing. And in it, they argue basically that it's a mistake to think of every human characteristic that has been produced by evolution as being specifically the product of adaptation. And Gould argues basically that when the brain became big, it wasn't selected for language in the process of becoming big, but the capacity for language appeared almost as a non-selected byproduct. And that is certainly a view that I adhere to. It's one of the things, I don't agree with Steve Gould on everything, but I certainly agree with him on that.
About language in particular?
About language in particular being a spandrel. Now here's the interesting thing. If we look at the human fossil record, and I'm thinking about the drawing behind me up there, it's remarkable that in our ancestry, over the space of about 1 million years, one human organ quadrupled in size. It's not the one behind the fig leaf. That human organ that... I'm tempted to make an even cruder joke, but I will not. But that human organ is the brain. And to this day, we do not understand what the forces were that led the brain to undergo such incredible hypertrophy. And in so doing, it produced a number of unique structures, which are clearly modified versions of what were typical parts of a primate brain, but are organized in a somewhat different way in us. And as a result of that, yes, we're smarter. There are other animals that have intelligence, other animals that have morality, other animals that can do a variety of things which we can also do. But as a result of that hypertrophy of the brain, there is a chasm, there's an enormous gulf between us and other animals. We're the only animal species debating this very question. And I think that alone, we invented science, we discovered evolution, we invented relativity or discovered relativity, we do higher mathematics, and this is all the result of this incredible hypertrophy, and it's a spandrel. We weren't selected to do calculus, we weren't selected to compose symphonies, but we have that capacity nonetheless.
Go ahead. Could I just go back to the soul again? I'm still a little bit hung up on the soul. So
he's fixated.
So what about this argument? So I survive bodily death. No physical animal survives bodily death. Therefore, I'm not a physical animal. Do you accept that?
Let me jump in here. I think this is laboring a point which is really begging the question. I mean, your arguments didn't seem at all plausible to me, if I might say.
Okay,
because it seemed to simply beg the question.
I thought you were the moderator.
For one thing,
Ian, what premise
I can't resist because I'm going to push.
Give the guy a break.
I'm going to push it in a totally different direction. Okay.
Ian, what premise do you deny?
I'm going to push it in a totally different direction.
Okay. Right.
I take a worldview to be a metaphysical position from which one understands and interprets the world. And you made the point that you thought that atheism was not a worldview. Right. And I wonder why you say atheism is not a worldview in that sense.
Well, sorry, just tell me what you thought. I thought you gave an excellent...
it's a metaphysical position from which one understands and interprets the world.
But the mere claim that there aren't any gods, of course, in some uninteresting sense of metaphysical, it's metaphysical. I mean, at least it tells you what there isn't. There isn't a certain kind of thing. So it's like the belief that that there aren't any unicorns, let's say. Surely that is a very thin foundation on which to build any interesting conclusions about how you should live or what the world is like or something. I mean, I mean, if that's all you've got, that there aren't any gods, it seems to me you can make virtually no progress whatsoever.
So on that basis, would theism also not be a worldview?
No, because it's much more substantive. It's much more positive.
No, I was careful about to say theism, okay?
Oh, theism.
The belief that there is a God, okay? Is that not a worldview?
Well, the mere, I guess, that's a good point. Yeah, the mere belief that there is a God, again, that's a very thin starting point.
I'm trying to find some differences between these guys.
That's not a worldview. But of course, as soon as you start adding the doctrines of the Catholic Church or something like that, then you've got a worldview.
Yeah, you may think you've found differences, but I think you've found similarities.
Okay.
Because I completely agree with you that atheism, as such, is not a coherent single worldview. The quote that you showed from that book basically equated atheism with science. Yeah. And I think there are so many religious people who do science, who have done science, that is sort of demonstrably false on its face. And you're right that atheism is not a coherent worldview. And I think I also agree with you that to some extent theism is, because once you suppose gods, as you get specific about them, you do have a worldview of a certain sort.
At least,
so I agree with you on that point.
At least as soon as you agree that, as soon as we've established that there's a God, you've got some kind of research program going. Because then you would want to ask, well, okay, what is this thing like exactly? Does it make various demands of me or something like that? But if your starting point is just that there isn't a God, well, that's the end of that, and let's move on to something else.
Okay, now if you don't mind, what I would say is that atheism, to be a coherent idea, is predicated on a statement. And the statement I would predicate it on is that nature is self-explanatory. And what I mean by that is that we require no explanation at all outside of nature to explain the physical and chemical and biological universe as we see it. I don't have the faith to accept that, to say that nature is self-explanatory. So what I'm fond of saying, and I'll say it again tonight, is I don't have the faith to be an atheist. To me, the universe does require an explanation. The philosopher's very ancient question of why is there something rather than nothing is still a valid question. And as many people, including physicist Paul Davies, have pointed out, the laws of physics themselves demand an explanation that stands somehow out of science. Whether that is a physical explanation or a spiritual explanation, nature is not self-explanatory. And ultimately, if I had to tell someone why I am a theist, it is because precisely I think that nature, as we see it, requires an explanation. And the more we know of the world from science, the more it begs that explanation. And to me, theism provides it.
But you go beyond theism, right? So you are a Christian in the Roman Catholic tradition. What is persuasive or appealing to you? What persuades you that Christianity is true?
Okay. I think the most important quality in any person of faith, and I'm really serious about this, is humility. And I don't mean the kind of false humility. I mean genuine humility to say, I don't know for certain. There's a reason why belief is called faith and not certainty. And in my own particular case, the reason I adhere to the faith I do to begin with is because, first of all, I was brought up in a Catholic household. It was a rather interesting one because my father, for 2.5 years, had studied for the priesthood prior to World War II. Before, as he was to tell me much later on, he decided he liked girls too much and this was not going to work. He dropped out, was drafted into the army, fought in World War II, came out of the war, fell in love with a non-Catholic girl. They were married by a minister in 1946. I was born in 1948. They were remarried by a priest in 1950. Guess what that made me in the eyes of my father's relatives? The answer is a child born out of wedlock. And when I was a young kid, that's how I was treated. And my father said that none of his sons, he only had sons, none of his sons were going to go to Catholic school because he felt that it had taught him there were only Catholics in the world. So I got a profoundly secular education. Like many people in college, I just walked away from the church twice. This is all a bunch of nonsense. It's like a Santa Claus story. I'm not interested in it. But both times I came back to it. And I came back to it, I would not say with the zeal of a convert, but basically with an appreciation that a scientific worldview, because I wanted to be a scientist ever since I was in my very early teens, that a scientific worldview was indeed compatible with faith. And to me, that was a revelation that both confirmed my vocation as a scientist and also helped to complete my worldview in terms of the place that science held in my understanding.
Thank you.
Sorry, I keep wanting to ask Ken.
I wanted to ask you, I wanted to ask you a
Sure.
sort of symmetric question.
Yep.
Okay, which is basically this. You know, you are unpersuaded that there is a God, or you are perhaps persuaded that there is not a God.
Right.
What is it about that position that is persuasive to you?
Well, I guess I just naturally came across this point of view when I was quite young and have never really departed from the faith. I mean, look, everyone here, unless there's some sort of exceptionally ecumenical universalist, thinks that numerous gods mentioned in religious teachings do not exist. There aren't any such things. The gods of the ancient Egyptians don't exist. And of course, no doubt many people in the audience draw the line at one particular god, but for the vast majority of them, they are atheists. I just go one better. But all of you, it's sort of interesting that Ian directed that question to me because it's really a question for everyone. So everyone is an atheist about some gods, and then the question is, well, why are you an atheist about those gods? And it's, maybe it's not a completely easy question to answer.
Okay.
I
And
certainly
Alex,
agree with that.
would you adhere to Bertrand Russell's answer when he was asked, let's suppose you die,
Yeah.
and then you're confronted by God? Russell, being a famous atheist and mathematician, what would you say to God? And Bertrand Russell's answer was, darn it, you didn't give us enough evidence that you exist.
Yeah.
Would you adhere to that explanation?
No, I would be terrified, I tell you. But yeah, sorry, just on the let me actually ask you about faith. So you did make here's a general sort of confusion about knowledge, that it requires certainty. But it's a mistake that Descartes is often thought to have made. But just in general, knowledge doesn't require certainty. You can know something even though you're not absolutely certain of it. And that's good, because we're not, we're absolutely certain only of, at best, very few things, and we commonly take ourselves to have a vast amount of knowledge. We know that the Earth is very old, for example. So what you just said about knowledge not requiring certainty, that doesn't really distinguish faith from knowledge in general. And I take it you do think that you have theological knowledge. You know that God exists, that Christ was his representative on earth, and so forth.
I would never say that I know these things. I would say that I believe these things.
But would you assert them? Would you just come out and say them?
I would assert that this is my belief, but I would not say that I know for certain that God exists.
Okay, you just said no for certain, but would you actually just assert them? So you're just happy to say God exists. The earth is round, the earth is old, God exists, just cycling through some laundry list of facts. Would you just be happy to say that God exists?
Every Sunday in church,
Yeah.
in the middle of the Mass, I stand up and say, I believe in one God. That's the beginning of the Nicene Creed.
Yeah.
And the word is believe. I would not say, I believe that living things are made out of cells. I believe that the earth is round. Rather, I would say, living things are made out of cells. The earth is round. And that's why things like the Nicene Creed or the Apostle Creeds are statements of belief and not statements of certainty.